Hello, I'm Dr. Christiansen. I want to take just a few minutes to review some major points in our readings for this week. I suggest that as we do this that you have your book with you as we go through these points. If you don't, stop this, pause it, and then start it again when you have your book. Let's begin. In Chapter 1, the title is A Need for Simple Methods of Policy Analysis and Planning. The need for some organization, simplification, and direction of complex problems that are called in public administration wicked problems, that there doesn't seem to be very often a good solution for some of these problems. That's where we need someone, the policy analyst, to cut through the complexity and confusion and to clearly define the problem and to offer recommendations for action. The section 1.1, quick basic policy analysis. And again, if you follow along in your book, I will be referring to some figures and illustrations. That quick basic analysis is what we're going to be focusing on throughout this book and throughout this course. It's one that must be done quickly and often with very little notice. Often as you are accompanying an administrator to a board meeting or to some other kind of governance board, you may be walking and talking at the same time. You may be doing all of the steps of defining the problem, finding solutions, etc., as you're walking. Hopefully that won't happen too often. It has happened to me. And for that reason, For that reason, I urge you to spend some good time in these first two chapters and to learn the basic process, the steps in the process, so that they become natural for you in how you evaluate and design and present your recommendations to whomever you want to give an informed set of alternatives for them to make a decision. If you look at page 4 in your textbook is the classic rational problem-solving process. And it really is a 6-step process. If you just go around the process and do this with me, number 1 is to define the problem. And that is not as simple as you might think it is. Some of these problems are very complex. And what we're trying to do for the decision makers, we're not making the decisions. We are public administrators. We don't make those kind of policy decisions. But we can help those who do. And so in our analysis of the policy that is needed, we first of all have to be able to clearly define what the problem is. The second step is to determine how you're going to evaluate possible solutions to that problem. You don't just pick the first one that comes along. You set up evaluative criteria so that you are able to solve the problem in the way that you are either recommending that it be solved or in the way that the board or your administrator has requested you to solve the problem. In other words, is the best solution the cheapest, the quickest? What are time and cost constraints? How are we going to judge possible solutions? That's what this step number 2 is. Step number 3 is actually identifying possible solutions to the problem in step number 1 that we have defined. Step number 4 is to evaluate these policies using the criteria from step number 2. So we define the problem, we define how we're going to judge the criteria. We're going to pick these criteria, how we're going to judge and select the criteria so that we can evaluate possible solutions, possible remedies for whatever problem we're presenting in step 1. And then in step 4, we use those criteria to evaluate the policies. We select the policy that best meets the criteria in step number 5, and step 6, the policy is implemented. Generally, as a policy analyst, we would not be heavily involved in implementation. That is for other administrators, but on a small agency, it might be you as well. Notice that there's a dotted line between step 6 and step 1. This is a point at which evaluation could occur after implementation. The text outlines 2 kinds of evaluation. One is the evaluation that occurs before the implementation of the policy. That is called ex ante. The Latin term anterior, ante, means before. The other way of evaluation is to wait until after the implementation is done, after the policy is in effect, to see how it's working, to see what results come out of it. That's called ex post. So we have anterior, posterior, ex ante, ex post. After is the usual kind of evaluation. It's not always the best. And it's, just to skip ahead a little bit, it's not the kind of evaluation that we would be doing, because we as policy analysts, or at least in the role of a policy analyst, are going to be advising people who are going to adopt and design a particular policy. And we have to be able to guide them and to be able to give them good information in terms of what the evidence or what our research shows will be possible results, possible problems, etc. So I skip ahead to page 13 in your text. And page 13 is a good example of data that might be presented to a board or to an agency, possibly to a county board, possibly to a state legislature. Whichever governance unit is going to be making a decision to adopt a policy, they have to have credible information. That's what policy analysis is. This is a very good example of a simple table that illustrates the problem. The problem is deciding where there's going to be development of a major mall. This affects a city tremendously in terms of where it's located, because that's where people are going to shop and spend their money. This could be in the suburbs. It could actually be outside the city limits. It could be downtown. It's an important decision to make. And it illustrates here what the results are anticipated to be in terms of which location, if it's downtown, on the mall, or someplace else, is going to be the most profitable for the city in general, in terms of business, in terms of employment, that kind of thing. So the other thing it shows is the kind of criteria that are being used. The criteria is strictly the annual retail trade that results. So it's a cost benefit type of illustration. And the third value of this chart, remember, is on page 13, table 1.2. The third benefit is that it shows possible alternatives. Building downtown, building someplace else, or how many square feet it's going to be. All of those things make a difference. Now, this isn't a complicated chart, but there's something missing. If this were a presentation and that chart were put up, I would be a severe critic of this chart. And the reason why is, remember, our whole point is to keep it simple and understandable. We are presenting important decisions to people who are not trained in these areas. They are sitting in that decision seat because they were elected. There are no qualifications to be elected to anything. Well, maybe the county attorney, yes, it should be a lawyer. But in terms of education, in terms of experience, we have very unexperienced people many times who are sitting in these decision seats. This is all new to them. So my criticism of this, it's a good chart, but my criticism is that there is no explanation of where the data comes from. That's a natural question. And there's no explanation of what the law of retail gravitation means. I mean, who knows what the law of retail gravitation is? Well, if you're an economist, you would. It simply means that people tend to buy things from retail centers that are larger. If you were comparing traveling to a small town to make purchases, or traveling to a larger area, maybe in the suburbs, maybe downtown, all other things considered equal, the law of retail gravitation means that people will tend to go towards the larger retail center. That's important for them to understand, and that has not been explained here. So keep it simple, keep it understandable, and look at it through the eyes of a person who's not an expert. That is the whole point of what we're doing with basic, quick analysis, policy analysis. Well, the argument in 1.4 of chapter 1 is, the argument of this book is that it is arguing for a rational, clear, uncomplicated, basic policy analysis that runs all the way through this book. Keep that in mind. We're not interested in presenting extraordinarily complicated mathematics or charts that have to be deciphered, etc. Keep it simple. If it's too complicated, don't use it. Don't use it, because it won't be effective. The organization of the book, it also covers in chapter 1. The first 9 chapters are on this rational process. That chart on page 4 that we talked about, we elaborate that through 9 chapters. When we're done with 9 chapters, we will have a policy analysis process that we can use to evaluate any proposed policy. And then in chapters 10 through 15, we will practice this approach on practice cases. So, chapter 2, it starts to go into the policy analysis process. And I want you to look at pages 24 to 25. And on page 24 to 25, it talks about the description of the types of policy analysis. We run into the same terms again, ex post or ex ante, meaning analysis after implementation, ex post, or analysis before the implementation, ex ante. In this class, we're going to focus on the ex ante, the predictive policy analysis. Then in chapter 2, from pages 27 to 39, section 2.3, there is a rather long discussion of values, ethics, professional conduct of the policy analyst. This is public service, and it is a public administrative task, and it does involve ethics. There is no universal definition of the difference between morals or ethics. Don't worry about that for our purposes. There's also no agreement on a common ethical code for policy analysts. So it's important in how you approach your work in all of public administration to have a sense of your role ethically. So on page 31, on figure 2.2, there is a rather complicated diagram, flowchart perhaps, that outlines two major approaches to ethics. Number one, deontological theory. Deontological theory evaluates conduct, the ethics of conduct, behavior, policies, that type of thing, on the basis of duty or process. How did you act? Were you loyal to the authority that was directing you? Did you follow the rules? That type of thing. It's basically duty-oriented. The second way you can look at ethical conduct is what is called the teleological theory. The teleological theory evaluates conduct on the basis of results. What are the consequences? So when you look at this figure on page 31, and you remember our problem-solving process from chapter 1, choosing evaluation criteria would be easy if there was just one criterion to be selected. For instance, overall cost. If that's how you are going to judge whether it is right or not, that is fairly simple. But just like evaluation criteria for policies, there's often more than one criteria. There's often a balance between criteria in terms of recommending a policy and actually in terms of evaluating conduct to see whether or not it is ethical. And that means that we have to look at both of those theories. We have to look at the deontological theory, the theory of duty, the theory of following a process of being true to the orders or the directions that we were given. But it also means that we have to look at teleological, which is how those who are affected by our behavior, who are affected by the directions or other actions we may take, how are they affected by it? What are the results? What are the consequences for them? So there's no clear answer here. I think that's why they've spent so much time on it here in the book. Consider both theories. Consider how you would choose and combine them. It is very much situational, professionally. Now there are times when the balance goes one way or the other. But in most situations, it's much more complicated than that. Do it rationally, which means you have a logical explanation. Now we move to the basic policy analysis in 6 steps, section 2.5 of chapter 2. So I want you to carefully compare page 44. 44 is another cyclic diagram that very much resembles our diagram in figure 1.1. You know, the classic rational process. Actually, we find out that the policy analysis process, it's really just the same chart. It's just been elaborated somewhat, some detail added to it, and we will continue to add detail to it as we go. This chart, these two figures actually, 1.1 and 2.5, these figures are the most important in the entire book. You have to know this model. You have to be able to explain it clearly and concisely. You have to have enough practice with it that it becomes second nature. And the order in which these steps occur becomes second nature. There is a rational basis for doing it this way. It is a defensible basis, and we want to make sure that the recommendations that we give to whatever policy board, whatever decision board we've been asked to do this, that we're protecting ourselves in terms of our approach, but we're also protecting them in terms of the approach that we are recommending to them. So, thank you very much. I hope this was useful.